for Indian cricket.
It was a tournament of firsts. The first time the Cricket World Cup had moved out of Great Britain. The first time you got to see a hat-trick in a World Cup. The first time a Man of the Match award was shared in a World Cup game. We are talking about the 1987 World Cup. You're watching World Cup Rewind with me, Nikhil, and alongside me is Rajdeep Sardesai. In our first episode, we took a closer look at the 1983 World Cup, at which point Rajdeep was an 18-year-old hanging around in the UK. By now, you were 22, playing probably little higher standard cricket, and in India.
No, let's not talk about the quality of the cricket that I was playing at the time. I was by then in a university in England itself, at Oxford. This was the World Cup I actually didn't watch on the ground. And that was a regret because it was in India. But it's a historic World Cup in many ways. The first World Cup in India and outside England after 3 World Cups. The first World Cup where we Indian fans got to see all the matches live on Doordarshan. And there's a whole story about how Doordarshan got the rights ahead of many of the private players. So you actually, in the age of color TV, were seeing a major sports tournament live on air. And I was just looking at it, the Sensex, as we know it, was launched in 1986 with about 25-30 trading companies. And at 1987, was trading around 540 points. Look at where it is now. So it was a very different India, Nikhil. Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, and the Ramayana and Mahabharata were going to become big serials on television. We didn't have any 24/7 news channels.
Oh, that's right. Plenty has changed since that time. Look at the Sensex. I just wish I had invested in a few shares at the time. But Rajdeep talks about Rajiv Gandhi being the Prime Minister. He played a pivotal role while that tournament was being organized. We'll bring you all the details. But the most important point, before we get into how the tournament panned out for various teams, was the fact, as we pointed out, that the World Cup was taking place outside of the UK for the very first time and in the Indian subcontinent. Very interesting story behind that. But for that, let's enter the Eden Gardens. Fascinating story as to how the 1987 World Cup comes to India. For that, I'll take you back to 1983. And as the famous story goes, N.K. Salve, who was then the BCCI president, was given only 2 passes to watch the final. At that time, you had the Test and County Cricket Board that would look after English cricket. N.K. Salve, as many VIPs came to watch that final. Rajdeep had narrated the story of how his father also travelled. There was special flights that came from India for that final in '83. And as president of the BCCI, N.K. Salve had to arrange for a lot of passes. He was denied those passes by the TCCB at the time. There was no English Cricket Board. And then it is believed that he had a meeting a day after the final with the then head of the Pakistan Cricket Board, Air Marshal Noor Khan. They sat together and they said, you know what, we have to take the World Cup away from the colonial masters. They've lorded over this game for a very long time. We need to bring it back to India. I believe at that time, N.K. Salve was also a minister in the Congress government. He picks up the phone, calls up Indira Gandhi, gathers some sort of support. And the way the World Cup then comes to India is that at that time, £20,000 is something that the English Cricket Board would offer each participating team. That's the kind of purse that they would offer. And when this goes into voting in the ICC, that time India and Pakistan's joint bid, supported by the government of that time, they offer double that amount. They say, we'll give you £40,000 or so for each participating team, and then all teams have to vote in that, yes, we want the tournament then to be shifted, and then the tournament is shifted to India. Rest, as they say, is history.
One additional fact. Yes. One of those VVIPs who couldn't get a pass for the main stand was Siddharth Shankar Ray. He was a major minister, a former West Bengal chief minister in Indira Gandhi's cabinet in the 70s. And he was the one who told Salve that, look, this is not done. And he met Mrs. Gandhi, who then contacts NKP Salve, who is a Congress leader at the time, and they decide to have this bid. But look at the interesting element of what you just said.
Yes.
How the world has changed. 87, India and Pakistan have a joint bid. Now in 2023, we've got a battle. Will Pakistan come to India? Look at how the world changes. So when you look at that, it's very interesting because you had General Zia-ul Haq at that time in Pakistan, and you had Rajiv Gandhi here. And General Zia, if you will recall, had actually flown to watch an India-Pakistan test match in Jaipur, where he had come with this, a carpet was part of the gifts that were being given by both sides to each other. So 87 is ironically a moment where India and Pakistan are playing a lot of cricket with each other, to the point where they are actually willing to host a World Cup together. It was a very different world.
Well, that's right. And then another major player at that time, they say Dhirubhai Ambani actually stepped in because they needed to raise a lot of money. We'll get into the broadcast, which then Rajdeep will mention a bit more of. But they go to an industrialist like Dhirubhai Ambani, and then he promises to chip in with the sponsorship. Initially, I believe they needed an amount of 4 odd crores to ensure that the World Cup comes. He says, okay, he was a nationalist of sorts, would love, India hosting it. They changed the name to Reliance Cup. It's no more than the Cricket World Cup or the Prudential World Cup as we had known. It becomes the Reliance World Cup. And the head of the organizing committee at the time was a certain Anil Ambani. He's given the responsibility that organize this World Cup, let it happen in India. And now we'll take a closer look at that first game, because unlike 83, where India tasted success in the first game, 87, that wasn't to be. Okay, India's first game happens at the Chepauk in Chennai. The opponents, Australia. Now, remember, Australia at that time were the underdogs. They weren't quite favored to win this particular tournament. India were the favorites in this game. And there was a bit of history, because just a year ago, on this very ground, these two teams had played a tight test match. Only the second tight test match in the history of test cricket. And believe you me, this ODI game could very well have been a tie. India go on to lose this game by just 1 run. Memories of this game.
Even before the memories, that tight test, had there been DRS, Maninder Singh was probably not out, which is, of course, one of the stories of Indian cricket. LBW, and the match is tied in 86. They play each other in 87. And in a way, history repeats itself, because in 83, West Indies are the holders and they lose the opening match to India. In 87, India are the holders and they lose the opening match to Australia. And, it was a huge disappointment, because look at how the world has changed. In 83, we go to a World Cup with 0 expectations. In 87, we are expected to win. And one of the truisms of World Cups is all the way from 75 down to 2011. For 26 years, the hosts don't win a World Cup, because the pressure and the expectations of being the host, I think, somewhere told on that Indian team. And I think that first match, losing by 1 run, I think revealed just how this Indian team was facing the weight of home expectations.
Okay, now there was a moment in this game which is very important. It was spoken about more after the game was done, because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, India lost this match by just 1 run. Now remember, Australia, they won the toss, put the Australians in, which was a bit surprising at the time. You had Jeff Marsh and David Boone as their openers. They had a great tournament going ahead, but have a 100-run plus stand when they come out to open. One of them is out, Dean Jones comes in, and then there is a controversial moment in the match. He skies a ball, and you've got Ravi Shastri on long on. He actually drops a catch. It's a catch coming straight at him. He drops the catch. The ball then goes for 4. Now, there's a bit of a controversy there, because Dean Jones, the batsman, feels that it should have been signaled a 6 because it has gone over the rope. The umpires consult different players. Kiran More, the wicketkeeper at that time, insists that no, the ball had bounced and it is a 4. It is given a 4 by the umpires. And then the score at the end of the innings is 268 for Australia. But during lunchtime, you have the manager of the Australian team go up to the Indian team saying that that was a bit unfair. We reckon it was a 6. Kapil Dev, as part of a sporting gesture, agrees. He says, fine, if you insist that it was a 6, we'll give that. The score is changed from 268, that becomes 270, which means India has to chase 271. Just to reiterate, the difference at the end was just 1 run.
In those days, you went by what the player said. It was a very different world, Nikhil. So different that our friend Mr. Navjot Singh Sidhu, who has gone through many avatars over the years, was suddenly unleashed on the world stage. And I remember that very clearly because I saw Sidhu play an under-22 match in the early 80s. And the fact was that while he was technically solid, he would struggle to hit the ball to the boundary. He was someone who would take 5 hours, 6 hours to score 100. And suddenly out of nowhere comes Sixer Sidhu, a name that stuck with him for the next 20 years. And Australia, in a way, that match began the story of Sixer Sidhu.
Remember, India had lost the first game unexpectedly because you were playing at home. From there on, they had to really up the ante. Remember, there were 4 teams in a group. You were going to play the remaining 3 teams in your group twice. India, from there on, in their remaining 5 games from there on, go on to win those 5 games and top the table. And then amongst the 5 games that India win from there on is that game that nobody will forget, the game that took place in Nagpur, plenty of records, India versus New Zealand, the final league game for India.
That's right. Sunil Gavaskar,
Yes.
you know, glorious career, but in one-day cricket had the ignominy of 36 runs in 60 overs in the first World Cup. By 1987, he's scoring his first ODI century. And what a 100 it was, because, you know, and I saw Sunil Gavaskar post-retirement, he would come to play for our club side on Saturday games. And he would invariably hit a couple of sixes. And I remember asking Mr. Gavaskar, what was it about the 1970s that there you were this defensive genius, and in the 80s we see a new Gavaskar. And he said, Rajdeep, I was unshackled of the burden of having to carry the entire team on my shoulders. And I think that innings, therefore, that Mr. Gavaskar played showed that when you're a great player, you make the adjustments. From 75 to 87, Mr. Gavaskar had made the adjustment, but he was not the only hero.
Yes.
There was someone else who was a hero, equally fascinating character.
Absolutely. Chetan Sharma, you know, Mr. Gavaskar, I've spoken to him so many times, and that 35 comes in various conversations. And he says, everyone remembers that 35. Nobody will remember that I scored the second fastest 100 in ODI cricket at the time. And he says, you know, that is something that is quite ignored. Was his only century that came in ODI cricket towards the end of his career. It was the last international tournament that he took part in. But Rajdeep talks about Chetan Sharma. I remember that hat-trick. I was a young boy of 10 years of age. I remember that hat-trick. Each of those dismissals, I can run you through those dismissals. The first one is an in-cutter, and you have Rutherford, if I'm not mistaken, and he gets his middle stump. You know, it's the ball. Chandrakant Pandit is the wicketkeeper, I clearly remember. Chetan Sharma. And you know, in the situation that New Zealand is, I think it's the last 10 overs to go, and many believe that Manoj Prabhakar should be brought in because the first 5 overs that Chetan Sharma had bowled weren't great. And remember, this is the same Chetan Sharma who again a year ago has cost India a game in Sharjah, the most infamous of them all, that last ball 6 hit against Chetan Sharma of Javed Miandad hits him for that 6, and now he's playing a World Cup game, hasn't had a great first 5 overs in this particular match, but Captain Kapil Dev, who also is a state captain, lest we forget, brings him on at that situation where New Zealand are now going to go attacking because they've had a good first 40 overs or so. Rutherford is the first batsman that he gets out. It's the ball that pitches around off stump, but then comes in a bit, gets that middle stump. The second wicket is that of Ian Smith. Now the current generation will know him as a famous commentator. But that ball just actually goes straight, stays a bit low, gets his off stump. And then there is a long conversation between Kapil Dev, Chetan Sharma. They keep discussing for a long time, I remember. And then Chetan Sharma on a hat-trick bowls that delivery. It's Chatfield who's had a great time with the ball in the World Cup. And he gets again a ball that bounces, comes in, an off-cutter of sort. This time gets the leg stump. So all 3 bowled, and all 3 getting the 3 different stumps. You've got the off stump, middle stump, leg stump. And I remember this image of Chetan Sharma running and falling at the feet of Chandrakant Pandit and really holding it.
You know,
those images.
You know, Chetan Sharma, remarkable because just a year ago hit for a last ball 6 by Javed Miandad, which also was a game-changing shot in a way in India-Pakistan cricket, perhaps the most famous single shot in India-Pakistan cricket. But I'll tell you a Chetan Sharma story. 1979-80, for the first time, we have what is called the Under 15 Vijay Merchant Trophy at the time. I'm representing West Zone, and along comes someone from North Zone, a team that includes Maninder Singh, but also includes a certain Chetan Sharma. And the reason I remember is because we were kids. Chetan Sharma was also supposed to be a kid, but he was a kid who had a bit of a dadi. And that's when we first thought, do these North Indian players who come to play these age group crickets, are they really their age group? I keep asking Chetan Sharma, please tell me, in 1979-80, when you played under 15, tu 15 saal ka tha ya 17 saal ka tha? Chetan, of course, insists he was 14, but you know, he had that ball.
Pace.
He had two things to him. He had a nasty bouncer. Even as a young 15-year-old, you know, for us, he was a nasty bouncer, and he had a very sharp in-swinger. He was a genuine bowler on relatively benign Indian wickets. He could get you that kind of skiddy bounce.
Just to let you a bit about this game as well, the New Zealand game, some more details. India, remember, in this game, not only had to win this game, they needed to chase the total down. 221 is what they were chasing. They had to chase it down in 42.2 overs, if I'm not mistaken. That is because if they did that, because Australia had won the same number of games as India, that way India could top the table, because India were looking to avoid playing Pakistan in Lahore. If they had topped the table, then they would get to play England at home. And that is what they wanted. They wanted to play in Wankhede. They wanted to play at home. So India wanted to top the table, and India did chase it down. In those days, to get 221 in 42 odd overs was close to 5.5 runs an over, which was again very rare. India did it. It all started with Sunil Gavaskar and that quick fire 100 that he got. From here on, India were in the knockout stage. India-Pakistan final seemed to be the most obvious final. That wasn't to be. We'll tell you the stories of the semi-finals up next.
What a great day for Indian cricket.
Now, where we're standing is the Eden Gardens. This wasn't the venue for the semi-final. This was the destination that India were chasing, because India were hoping to be in the final. Up against an English team. And why do I say that the Indian team were bullish? Because remember, one, they were playing at home. Two, England was suspect against spinners, and they had lost both their matches in the group stages to Pakistan. Abdul Qadir, I believe, had picked up 7 wickets in those 2 games versus England. So you knew with Indian spinners, Maninder Singh was proving to be the best spinner of that World Cup. India also had Ravi Shastri. So all things were in favor of India at that time. Nobody gave England any chance. Quite a contrast to, I'm just going back to 83, where it was exactly the opposite, right? England playing India in the semi-final. Nobody was giving India a chance. India go on to win in that game. Similar here, nobody giving England a chance. And yet, England found a way, led by a certain Graham Gooch.
Graham Gooch, the couple of days before the game, got a couple of local Mumbai left-arm spinners to bowl at him on middle and leg. And he, for about an hour, just played the sweep shot. I don't know whether there were computer programmers in those days, but they clearly didn't watch the manner in which Gooch was almost prepared to sweep on length itself, if not line. And he got these 2 local bowlers to keep bowling at him in the belief that when it came to the match, he'd have Ravi Shastri and Maninder Singh bowling that line. And eventually, Graham Gooch's century, where most of his shots were playing that wonderful sweep shot that he had, made all the difference. I mean, that was the one, you know, you really thought that Indian team was much better than the English team, just as you thought that the English team 4 years ago was much better than the Indian team. So we, in a sense, you know, it was sweet revenge for the English, I'm afraid. And I felt particularly bad for Chandrakant Pandit. Because if you look at that match, here is this young, you know, relatively young player trying to make a mark for himself, looked in superb form, and then gets out at the wrong moment. And that happened to a number of Indian batsmen in that innings, including, of course, Kapil Dev, who holds out to the boundary. So a number of the key Indian batsmen, unfortunately, didn't produce on the big day. And the sad reality was Sunil Gavaskar at the Wankhede in Mumbai in his last international match in India. I'll never forget that, getting bowled to defratus. who, by the way, was a sharp bowler. I actually faced De Freitas in county cricket, and he could be a sharp bowler on his day. And he had a very good World Cup again. He knew exactly, he was a very good bowler in relatively unhelpful conditions at times as well. If they were helpful, he could be deadly.
Okay, that particular game is remembered for the Graham Gooch 100, 136 he got of 115 deliveries. As Rajdeep points out, him sweeping, square leg, and he would hit you for a 4 either to the left of square leg or then to the right of square leg, because he could find gaps anywhere that he wanted. 2 days of practice clearly helped him. 35-run loss for India, which meant just a day before that, by the way, India had also seen their arch rivals Pakistan lose to Australia in the semi-final. That again was an upset that happened in Lahore. Another upset here, and as many were expecting, it would be an India-Pakistan final at the Eden Gardens. It turned out to be an England-Australia finale. It's Australia versus England, an unlikely final, because at that time Australia weren't the dominating team that we've now come to know of. Remember, who are the stars for them in that World Cup? Things that were really working for them. Their openers, David Boone and Jeff Marsh, both of them had got 400 plus runs. David Boone, of course, a famous figure in India. And for the current generation, I'll paraphrase Jeff Marsh and tell you who he is. He's the father of Mitchell Marsh and Sean Marsh, players that are playing for the Australian team, at least Mitch Marsh is at the moment. So these two openers were in fine form. Then you had Dean Jones, who was a revelation in white ball cricket, ahead of his times at that moment, would get runs very quickly. Alan Border didn't have a great World Cup, but then they had two middle order batsmen in Valletta and Steve Waugh, both of them getting quick runs. And with the ball, Craig McDermott had been outstanding for Australia. So this was their winning combination, and they started off well, winning the toss and then batting first in a final. Big pressure game.
That's right. You mentioned Boone and Marsh, and I think they were the rock on which that Australian team was built in that tournament. Also the coming of age moment for Steve Waugh. Alan Border was the indestructible force of Australian cricket through the 80s, had seen them through good times and bad, mostly bad in the 1980s, but he was Mr. Consistent. He was always there. And a wonderful man. I could see, many years later when I met Mr. Border, he was such a calm, composed figure. One of the things that stands out about most World Cup captains is their ability to soak in pressure. The winning captains. And therefore, Border was part of that generation of Australians who could soak in the pressure. And he was remarkable, particularly in Indian conditions. But to my mind, the story of that final, because I was watching it with English friends, Nikhil, at Oxford, Australia get 253.
Yeah.
The English were reasonably confident. 253 was a good score, but not necessarily a match-winning score. The English had very good players of spin, not just Graham Gooch, but someone called Mike Gatting, who had a great record in India again. Gatting was in top form in that final, and then goes and plays a reverse sweep. Now, this was an age when most players didn't play the reverse sweep. So I was sitting with these English fans who were convinced that Gatting was taking them to victory, and then he plays this shot. And most of them had never seen this shot. And they were screaming away at Gatting. And many years later, I asked Mr. Gatting, what made you play the reverse sweep? He says, a moment of madness. And it was just that one moment of madness that probably cost England a World Cup in '87. It took them after that 32 years to actually win a World Cup. The country which sort of gave the world cricket and one-day cricket. But that Mike Gatting dismissal, I think, turned that entire final.
Right. England eventually fell 7 runs short of the target that Australia had put in front of them. This was coming of age of Australian cricket. From there on, they went on to dominate the cricketing world, not just in white ball, in red ball cricket as well. But I remember speaking to Dean Jones, and he says that, you guys keep harping about 83 underdogs. He said in 87, it was a bigger upset because we were underdogs. We won. One thing I remember watching that particular final on television, Rajdeep, is that Eden Gardens came out in full support of the Australian team. Every one of those fans were actually supporting the Australian team because probably they were the underdogs. No one was really cheering for the English team. Once Australia win, I remember them holding the trophy, Alan Border running around alongside, the periphery of the ground with the rest of his teammates, and the entire Eden Gardens standing up and giving them a standing ovation. I mean, that felt like as if the home team had won for the Kolkata faithfuls, because they couldn't have their Indian team. They went and supported Australia.
The great thing about the Bengalis is that they always love the underdog. So when, here you have a final, India, Pakistan, both not there. I think the Kolkatans chose their side. Full house, mind you.
Yes.
Full house at Eden Gardens, even though India is not playing, and they do choose the Australians as their side. Perhaps, they were anyone but England. Old colonial memories there, old memories of the Raj. We want the English to be defeated. And certainly on that day, Alan Border, as I said, was a bit of a, folk hero almost for Indian cricket fans of my generation. Very popular cricketer. Had come to India so often. Yes. And in the 80s, that's the other big transformation that takes place. In the 70s, the Australians rarely came to India. The great Greg Chappell, Ian Chappell, Dennis Lilly have never played in India. But in the 80s, the Australians started to discover India. And I think 87 in that sense is a turning point. And it starts a bit of a love affair that the Indian cricket fan from time to time has had with the Australian team.
Okay, it was an incredible World Cup. Didn't quite turn out the way that the Indian and the Pakistan fans wanted. But India, as I said at the start of our program, had a lot to gain, because from here on, they became a financial powerhouse in the world of cricket. Interestingly, India won 83. The World Cup, the next World Cup after that was hosted in India. Australia win the 87 World Cup. The next World Cup, where is it? It's in Australia in 1992. That's going to be coming up in the next episode of our special series. For the moment, from Rajdeep and I, thanks so much for watching.
Bye-bye. Namaskar.
What a great day for Indian cricket.